Good morning, everyone. We are officially recording. Welcome to week number 4, and we are 504. Today is our main task to really look at how that applies. And 504 was the first disability law to apply to those who had disabilities. Because going back in time a little bit, we had, Brown versus Topeka Board of Education, which says, hey, kids, black kids, brown kids, go to school with white kids. Okay. And in 64, we had President Johnson sign the Civil Rights Act, where you cannot discriminate based on race, religion, create all the protected categories. Unfortunately, it didn't include individuals with disabilities. And that's how 504 kind of got us rolling. But I'm gonna play a couple of videos just to kind of get us into the swing of things, because a lot of different things have happened in 504. In fact, we'll start out with why 504 is currently under attack. There's actually a lawsuit that talks filed by guess who, our Attorney General here in Texas, 70 other states, to eliminate 504, which is not good. So we'll do a couple of videos just to get you the feel why 504 is so important, and some of the history and some of the individuals. But here's a quick update on some things that are rather scary because of the climate we're in. Yes, we're not political, but we do talk politics because that's the reality.
Lawsuit that seeks to eliminate a key protection for people with disabilities. Recent social media posts have fueled concern over the potential elimination of discrimination protections. Victor Jacobo verifies the claims.
Social media posts have raised the alarm that a part of U.S. Law Code Section 504 could be at risk of being eliminated because of a federal lawsuit. So, is there a lawsuit seeking to eliminate Section 504? We checked with our sources, including the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, and a federal lawsuit that includes Texas and more than a dozen other states. First, according to the HHS, Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 protects qualified individuals from discrimination based on their disability. This protection is required for any organization that receives financial assistance from the federal government, impacting places like schools, hospitals, and more. We then looked for and found the lawsuit, Texas v. Becerra. That lawsuit, filed by Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton in September of 2024 against the Biden administration, seeks to throw out the inclusion of gender dysphoria in Section 504 protections. Paxton and others argue the rule is an overreach by the federal government and raises concerns of accommodating the protection. But in page 42 of the lawsuit, under demand for relief, along with declaring the inclusion of gender dysphoria in Section 504 a violation, the lawsuit also includes declaring Section 504 unconstitutional. So yes, it is true that there is a lawsuit involving Texas and 16 other states that could eliminate Section 504. And while the primary goal of the lawsuit targets a specific rule over gender identity, the lawsuit argues against Section 504's constitutionality and gives judges the option to eliminate it. The future of the lawsuit is uncertain, as the defendant, the Department of Health and Human Services, is now under the new Trump administration. With your Verify, I'm Victor Jacobo.
All right, so that's just, and that's just a, the reason we're starting there is, again, we're not political, but politics do have an impact. Now, this was filed in Ken Paxton, the Texas Attorney General, as well as 17 other states filed, and they did indicate that they would like 504 to be declared unconstitutional. And we have a new administration, which if everybody reads the papers, they have a little different trajectory than previous administrations. And so they have pulled back a little bit, but it was that one piece about gender dysphoria that set off the chain reaction in 17, essentially call them very conservative states. And so that's out there. Now it hasn't resolved, and they've since retracted a little bit of it, but that lawsuit is still pending. And that was something that was unimaginable before this as well. So just be aware, we're in a very interesting environment. There's some new, the new administration has many different ways of approaching education and disability, and just be aware of it. Again, we don't have an opinion, but you need to be aware. But let's go back in time, because 504, how did we get there? How did we begin to look at things? Oops, lost my screen here. Sorry about that.
So
And so one of the things that's really important is how did we get there? So let's talk, and there's a couple cases, everybody's pretty familiar with Brown versus Topeka Board of Education, but there's another lawsuit too that was really, really instrumental in a lot of the language out of Park versus Mills, which is out of Pennsylvania. And this is just a quick story on Park versus Mills.
This is the story of Jack Adams and his son Bobby in the Park versus Commonwealth of Pennsylvania court case.
Hi everyone, my name is Jack Adams and I'm from the small town of Warren, Pennsylvania. I have a wife, Mary, and 2 children, Bobby and Bella. And this is the story of how my son Bobby persevered and overcame all odds, changing schooling in Pennsylvania for children of the future. Back in 1971, Bobby was just old, entering the 3rd grade. Mary and I went to register him for school, but something I never expected happened. The school turned us away, refusing to teach and help Bobby. Bobby's teachers said that
Pennsylvania state law allows public schools to deny services to children who have not attained a mental age of 5 years by the start of the 1st grade or of the age of 8.
Bobby was going into 3rd grade and still had trouble forming words, let alone reading them. Bobby's teacher said he was always behind, but we never imagined the school would refuse to teach him altogether just because of his disability. How was he supposed to learn if no one would teach him? Frustrated and upset, my wife and I knew we had to do something about the situation. After hearing similar stories about this happening to other families, we formed the Pennsylvania chapter of the Association of Retarded Children, also known as PART. In 1971, we brought the seminal lawsuit, Pennsylvania Association for Retarded Children versus Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, the first right to education suit in the country, to overturn that Pennsylvania law and secure quality education for all children. As parents, we were arguing 3 main points. First, all children with mental retardation are capable of benefiting from education and training. Second, education cannot be defined as the only provision of academic experiences for children. And third, the earlier these students with mental retardation are afforded an education, the greater the amount of learning that could be predicted. After several debates and arguments, the court's order was made and final. 3 major changes were made to Pennsylvania schools. School districts were required to identify and start teaching all children with mental retardation. School districts were to develop evaluation programs for the most appropriate placement of the children, and on top of that, the State Department of Education was required to submit plans describing available programs, financial arrangements, and teacher recruitment and training efforts to provide education. Mary and I were thrilled that we were able to not only help out Bobby, but all the children of Pennsylvania who were going through the same thing as well. There's not a day that goes by that Bobby doesn't thank me for what we did for him. We truly made a difference that year, and Pennsylvania schools will forever be changed because of it.
And that led to the passage of 91-142, or sometimes the Educational Handicapped Act, which now allowed, it was the forerunner of IDA. So everything prior to the IDA, 1997, became the Educational and Handicapped Act. However, that was just schools. But what about wheelchair access? What about access to jobs? That was just education. That really became the educate, again, public law 91-142 was that first one passed. But what about 504? Well, there are still a lot of issues regarding 504. Congress did pass a 504 law that prohibited disabilities, but guess what? They didn't enforce it, which leads us to our next video. And also we want to talk about a couple of key characters, because usually, remember, it's not, it's a movement. But it's also key individuals, just like Mothers Against Drunk Driving. There's one mom that was pissed off that a drunk driver with 14 convictions ran over her 13-year-old daughter. Yeah, you don't mess with Mothers Against Drunk Driving. But we want to talk about some of the key individuals as well. But let's go. Because they passed the law, but after Congress passes the law, it has to go to the specific governmental entity to write the rules. So Nixon, Ford, and now we're at President Carter. What's going on? Why, why this law is written? And, after 4 or 5 years, the disability rights, they're getting pissed. And so here's what they do.
April
1977. One of the most important disability rights protests took place in the US. It was known as the 504 sit-ins, where disability rights activists across the US and especially in San Francisco occupied government federal buildings to demand greater accessibility and accommodations for disabled people. But why is it important to talk about that moment in history in this current moment in time? Well, currently in the US, disabled rights may be under attack, but to understand what's at stake, we need to go back a little bit. The 1977 protests were based around a bit of legislation known as Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. This bit of legislation would require the federal government to enforce affirmative action in regards to disabled people in the workplace, but also ensure that there is accessibility and accommodations in organizations that get federal funding. This would include hospitals, schools, post offices, train stations, and many more. But the issue at the time was that Section 504 wasn't actually being enforced and the regulations weren't getting published. This meant that it was impossible to check the regulations and actually enforce the law. So even though American disabled people had this bit of legislation, they weren't actually seeing the benefits from it. Without the regulations actually being published, accessibility wasn't really taking place. And without accessibility, disabled people are blocked from participating in society. Organizations who would have to comply with the regulations of Section 504 didn't really want to. They didn't want to spend the money to provide better accommodations and accessibility. And it's said that some of these organizations would lobby with politicians to try and weaken the regulations. From 1972 all the way up until the sit-ins, presidents at the time, like Nixon and Ford, would continuously delay and stall 504 being affirmed. By 1977, disabled people were fed up of waiting. They demanded that the Health, Education and Welfare Secretary, which at the time was Joseph A. Califano, sign the regulations of Section 504 or resign. He did neither. This led to the protest that we know as the 504 sit-ins. On April 5th, 1977, 10 protests happened across the US outside of health, education, and welfare offices. They happened in these places, but one place lasted longer than the others: San Francisco. Most protests ended after a few days, but the San Francisco sit-ins lasted for 26 days. Disabled people of all different life experiences occupied 50 UN Plaza in San Francisco. Key figures included Judy Heumann, Kitty Cohn, Brad Lomax, Dennis Phillips, and many, many more. To me, the most beautiful thing about these protests were the display of collaborative care. Makeshift fridges were made to keep food and medication cold. People with limited mobility were assisted to stop them from getting bed sores. And when telephone lines were cut, it was deaf people and other ASL users that were integral to keeping communication with people on the outside. Other groups also supported the sit-ins, and these groups included Glide Memorial Church, Brick Hut Lesbian Cooperative, the International Association of Machinists, the Salvation Army, and the Black Panther Party, which it must be stated that Brad Lomax was essential in forging this connection. Eventually, a delegation of protesters of the sit-ins traveled to DC, but even during the travel to DC, they were still dealing with barriers. Most transport was not accessible for wheelchair users, so they had the genius idea of hiring a box truck, which was able to transport multiple wheelchair users at the same time on a budget. But of course, no surprises here. The president at the time, by this point that would have been Jimmy Carter, wasn't interested in speaking with the protesters, nor was the Secretary of Health, Education and Welfare. They actively avoided the protesters. But by that point, there was so much media coverage on the 504 sit-ins that there was added pressure for the establishment to sign in the regulations. Eventually, Joseph A. Califano signed the regulations of Section 504. And with this victory, the remaining protesters left 50 UN Plaza. I love reading about this part of disabled history, but it's not just history. It's happening right now in 2025 because Section 504 is currently at risk. In September 2024, 17 states filed a lawsuit against the US Department of Health and Human Services. A large part of this lawsuit pertains to gender dysphoria in regards to Section 504, but also there have been talks about ruling Section 504 as unconstitutional in general. I should add though that upon recording this video, articles have come out stating that this lawsuit has been paused, so I guess we'll have to see what happens next.
I've written in the description some of my favorite US-based creators that have been keeping me in the know about the current situation with Section 504. You should definitely follow them. Of course, there are many more, and you can tag them below as well. Disabled people are some of the most creative people on the planet, as we constantly find creative ways to live.
Right, but and two more short videos, but also what's really important is who are these individuals? Because it wasn't just a movement, and I want to talk about two very important individuals and what made the 504 sit-in in San Francisco absolutely incredible was the amount of support it received from all the other communities. And there's one individual, you may or may not be familiar with him. We're going to talk a little bit about Brad Lomax, and he was a visionary in what he did, and he was absolutely amazing. And also, the Black Panther Party, which he was a member, helped keep that sit-in fed.
I'm Derek Warren, and today I'd like to talk to you about Bradley Lomax. Bradley Lomax was a member of the Black Panther Party. He was also a wheelchair user, a independent living activist, and his work supported the needs of people with disabilities in the community of Oakland, California. On April 5th, 1977, Bradley Lomax was a part of a group of protesters that ended up occupying the Health, Education, and Welfare building in San Francisco. They occupied that building to demand the signing of Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. And that section of the law provided protection against discrimination for people with disability. The 504 sit-ins were ultimately successful. The regulation was signed, and they actually have the record for the longest sit-in of a federal building in U.S. history. Part of the reason, one of the major reasons why the 504 sit-in was successful is because Bradley Lomax was able to get the Oakland chapter of the Black Panther Party to bring hot meals on a daily basis to the protesters who had to stay in the building. So when I see a student who's able to get support for their disability in school via a 504 plan, or if I see a person who uses a wheelchair who's able to benefit from accessible public transportation like a bus, in my heart I say thank you. Thank you to everyone who took part in and supported the 504 sit-ins. Thank you to the Black Panther Party, and thank you for Brother Bradley Lomax. His work really inspires me, and I hope he inspires you.
We're going to look at one more real quick, and you may have heard Judy Heumann. She was also, one of those activists that were just amazing in terms of what they did and how they approached things. It was just, but it's important to know those individuals. We carry on their work today. We are their legacy. Each time we go to a 504 meeting, each time we go to an ARD meeting, each time we look at something through the lens of ADA, we're carrying on their work. But remember, these are the individuals who saw things in a different way. And that's kind of what I hope we do in our 10 weeks together is let's look at things in a different way and how can we move forward? Because we're in a really challenging environment, just as they were.
Heumann, who has been called the mother of the disability rights movement, has died at the age of 75. President Biden, in a statement noting her passing, called her a, quote, trailblazer, a rolling warrior for disability rights in America. Heumann, who lost her ability to walk at age 2 after contracting polio, lobbied for legislation that led to the passage of the landmark Americans with Disabilities Act. Tonight, we hear her in her own words as we revisit her brief but spectacular take on the disability rights movement.
When I was 5 years old in Brooklyn, New York on East 38th Street, my mother did what every other parent did when their kid was 5. She took me to school to register me. And this was in the early 1950s. There were no motorized wheelchairs. So she pushed me to school and it wasn't accessible. She pulled me up the steps and the principal said I couldn't go to school because I was a fire hazard. I don't really know that there was an explanation. It just was. I think the average person, they see disability as a threat to not being able to do things as people have typically done them. And I think there's truth in that. But the question is it because one has a disability or because society itself has constructed itself in such a way because they haven't seen us? Discrimination against disabled people has existed from the beginning of time. And we're in a place right now where, because of other movements, civil rights movement, the women's movement, Black Lives Matter movement, etc., people are speaking up and out. One of the first pieces of legislation that the disability community really engaged in was getting regulations developed for a provision of law called Section 504. Section 504 says you can't discriminate against someone who has a disability if the entity is receiving money from the federal government. It was the first time that many of these young disabled people felt a part of something and really felt that they were making a difference, not only for their lives, but for the lives of many others. There is a shift, I believe, going on in our society where we're looking at race and gender equality and disability as issues that we need to address. That diversity is something that makes our companies stronger. That diverse businesses provide better services for customers. I also am a very big believer that the disability rights community cannot stand on its own. We need to be working with all other movements, and we want all other movements to be inclusive of disabled people. If we are actively learning and working together, we can do things like make sure when housing is being built in our communities that it's accessible, not just for people who have physical disabilities today, but if you're going to have a physical disability tomorrow. I think having a disability really has allowed me to do and get in touch with so many things and opportunities that otherwise would not have happened. People look at us as the label of our disability. And it is a part of who we are, but it is not who we are. My name is Judy Human, and this is my brief but spectacular take on the disability rights movement.
Hers was a life that made a difference.
Absolutely. She will be missed.
All right, we return ourselves to the regularly scheduled program. And we're going to share a couple things just to make sure, because a lot of times there is a flow between 504, ADA, and IDA. And so we're gonna make sure that we have that on the screen as well, because it's really important to make sure that we have that comparison at all times, because it applies to all students with disabilities. If you're covered under IDA, you're covered under IDA, you're covered under 504 and ADA. And ADA and 504 are very similar. It just, in fact, Section 2 of ADA, which we'll do next week, is very similar. So let's just kind of go through it real quick. And again, it requires every agency, school. Again, if you receive federal funding, okay, you're supposed to be an opportunity to be fully integrated into the mainstream. Now, this is a little different than LRE. Okay, LRE is least restrictive environment. So sometimes when we're trying to argue placement of a child, we're going to argue 504, because sometimes, as an example, we've done this probably 4 times or less, 3 years in Texas, 4 years, where they want to put a student in life skills because that's, because of the, what used to be the STAR test, or because that's kind of their policy. We tend to congregate those individuals with low cognitive function, either under ID or some type of medical impairment or low functioning autism, and put them in life skills. And so when you take them out of IDA, you can't put a child in a special ed classroom. So 504 usually applies. In fact, we've had 504 plans with a one-on-one. Doesn't always work, and you got to be careful. But sometimes if you refuse services of IDA, it goes into 504. Also, it talks about, what ADA and 504, having a physical or mental impairment, which, limits one of the major life functions. And we saw in a previous lesson, we'll cover more next week under ADA, and ADA is that impairment can include learning, focusing, thinking, and concentrating. Focusing, learning, thinking, and concentrating. Guess what? That's education. Again, it protects all folks in an educational setting. Remember, it doesn't homeschool, private schools, if you don't receive federal funds, they can kind of do what they want. So if in terms of schools that are faith-based or schools that are set up by parents and they receive no federal funding, because that's kind of the key. If they don't receive federal funding, it's kind of rough. Also, you'll see that ADA and 504 are the same. Again, we have both the programmatic accessibility as well as the architectural accessibility. As we're those, and if you think of those two categories, it's an either architectural accessibility, the handicap ramps, handicap bathrooms, handicap parking, etc., or is it programmatic? How do they participate in the program? Again, it's not a funded mandate. This is why a 504 meeting in Texas is usually just the 504 coordinator, who could be the counselor, assistant principal, or designated person. Usually they already have another job. One or two teachers, could be more, and the parent. So the 504 meeting in Texas is very, very informal compared to an ARD meeting. Also, if you'll see the definition of ADA, very much the same. Also, the child fine mandate, school district has responsibility. Okay, remember, ADA does not have a child fine, and so K through 12, it's responsibility of the school to identify. Once they get to college, it's on the student. Just like please keep that in mind. In college, students must self-identify. Okay, same way with under ADA. So you must self-identify. So a lot of times, if you're looking in college or in employment, if you're looking what is a reasonable accommodation, the request is initiated by the student or by the employee. It's not on the employer. Now, obviously, the employer should have accessible bathrooms, accessible walkways, accessible doors, etc. But just remember, the child fine duty of the school has that affirmative duty to identify and evaluate students with disabilities. After you graduate in college, employment, it's up to the student. Also, K through 12, evaluations and no expense to the student or parent. And after that, both in college as well as ADA, it's the responsibility of the student. Because essentially they're over 18, also same way with consent. You must consent to evaluations and placements, similar requirement IDA. Also in college, after you turn 18, the responsibility shifts to the individual who's 18. And so in college, the student has the responsibility for negotiating the accommodations plan. Also, when you look at IEP accommodations, the 504 is, again, they don't have the same amount of mandatory participants, same way as well as in college. It could be your disability service coordinator, could be a specific section, and and again, depending on where you go to college, some colleges and universities have really great disability services sections or special service sections on campus. Some of them don't. And then also placement in a regular classroom with to eliminate various educational experience on both elementary, secondary, and college students. And also all courses are mainstream. So please keep that in mind as to what that is. Okay, real important. Any questions so far? I'm just going to stop for a minute. Welcome those who have joined us. Thank you, Naomi. I see you found the link. Wonderful. And so one of the things to again kind of look at is, what is the actual definition of 504? What is it? How does it work? And I'm just going to put kind of the purpose and scope. And it's just a civil rights law. And 504 is the actual Rehabilitation Act. That's where it came in. I'll put it in the chat. And I think most of us are familiar with it at this point. All right, any questions so far about 504? And you saw somehow how it got there. So let's talk about the functional piece of a 504 meeting within schools. So first of all, there's going to be some definition of a disability. You've got to find that within the definition. Again, if they have a disability and it's a person with a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits major life activity. Now, unlike IDA, this is where your doctor's diagnostic impression or diagnosis, this is where the psychologist's impression, you don't have to make it a educational eligibility. So usually there's no requirement to have it under specific category. If it falls under to one of those categorical definitions or non-categorical definitions under 504 ADA, samey at this point, the school must evaluate. Child find responsibility is the same. 505. Now, again, a diagnosis alone does not necessarily qualify you for this, and this is where the 504 team comes in. Okay, 504. I mean, a diagnosis usually it's pretty presumptive, but a diagnosis alone doesn't equal eligibility because it's still up to the 504 team based on what does the student need in terms of accommodations. Now, most of 504 plans do have accommodations because there is no modified curriculum. Again, remember the difference between a modification and accommodation. Does everybody know that, or should I go back? Because you only have accommodations, no modifications. However, as part of accommodations, you can have a behavior plan. You can have a BIP. You can have a one-to-one. You can have related services. As long as it's not changing the curriculum, you can have that. Now in Texas, when you say, hey, I want a related service under 504, they're going to look at you a little strange and they'll say, that's special ed. Well, under funding, that's how the mechanism is actually set up. However, technically under 504, you can request related services. So sometimes the way we navigate that in Texas, hey, let's just do a consult. So a lot of times they don't meet the traditional, air quotes here, the two-prong eligibility is one, you have to have a disability under IDA, and you need specialized services. In other words, there's an educational need. Under 504, there's no educational need, but they still need something in terms of support. So sometimes the way we kind of navigate that here in Texas, because when you say related services under 504, even though it's permitted, technically, schools have all the related services under IDA. So we ask for a consult, or we ask for a training, or we ask for something to help the student, help the teacher to navigate those related services. Also, you can't be in a special ed classroom. And I mentioned that a lot because sometimes schools get confused and they'll place 504 students in special ed classrooms. No, you cannot. That's why we use that previously mentioned kind of hack is if we want somebody out of a special ed class, well, we just withdraw them from special ed and we get them into 504. Now, again, you got to be careful with that because sometimes they really need special ed, but sometimes just the threat of taking them away out of a special ed classroom. We do that a lot with our life skills class, either get a better curriculum or, especially at the younger ages, in high school, middle school, yes, there could be a large gap between academic achievement. But in kindergarten, first grade, second grade, third grade, why is it that we have to have these kind of gulag congregate settings that we've seen schools move to? Well, because it's, having a one-on-one is expensive. And also, if everybody is familiar with Texas, the STAR test, which is finally gone, is that it had an impact upon our schools because a lot of the principals' job criteria says, hey, we're going to maintain a recommended standard or standard of excellence that only we is judged by STAR. Now schools in Texas get A, B, C, D, E, or F, but a lot of it was still based on academic achievement. So that's why if you put a kid in life skills, you no longer have to take the regular assessment, which we call STAR. You can take the alternative 2, which is basically if you have 2 legs and a pulse, you pass. So just some of the oddball things here in Texas. All right. Okay. So one of the things that's really, really important is again, and it's an eligibility determined by assessment and data. The data pulls together the 504 plan, and then the 504 plan is implemented. And usually, again, it has to be usually in not a special ed environment, cannot be in a special ed classroom. So again, sometimes we get into co-teach or sometimes resource, where it's not special ed per se, but our 504 students may go there. Also in Texas, we've had a shift because traditionally we saw a lot of students with learning disabilities, dyslexia under 504, but now if we look at the updated manual, and we saw that shift back in 2015, where dyslexia was no longer called dyslexia as it was. You still call it that. So remember, under LD or dyslexia, usually you're going to get a special ed evaluation. A lot of parents kind of wince at that. My kid's not special ed. Well, yes, dyslexia, learning disability in Texas as we move into 2025-26 school year, samey. Make sure you have the dyslexia manual. I think they've just updated it. Let's get that on the screen. The dyslexia manual is really important because it gives you that guide to ensure that make sure you have that, because and there's going to be more updates as well. But please make sure you have the dyslexia manual. You can just Google it in if you want, or I can put the link. I'll put the link as well. Please make sure it's 100 page. It's it used to be 124. Now I think they got it down to 88. But the dyslexia manual helps guide us in that conversation. Okay. I will not go through that unless you really want to go there, but make sure you're familiar with the dyslexia manual, because some of the key pieces here, let's see. And again, free to share. And also one of the other things sometimes they will do, they talk about dyslexia screening. Just be aware of a dyslexia screener. I mean, right now it's universal, but sometimes those screeners are ways that our state keeps folks out of services. But just take a look at the dyslexia manual. I won't go into that unless you really want to, but the dyslexia manual is really important, as it really covers a lot of those things that are typically under 504. Also, if we do a breakdown of if we look at students with ADHD, and we'll see, if we were to do a Venn diagram, we'll see probably a third of the students roughly in special ed. We'll see about 2/3 of them in 504. And the reason I mentioned that is that was a big argument back in the 90s. Does ADHD qualify individuals for special ed? And there's no SEP letter that says yes, they do. So keep that in mind. Any questions? Okay, great. So the other thing that's really important as we look at special ed is what to do when it's not working. Okay, what to do when it's not working. And that's what I want to spend a good chunk in, because again, 504 is really simple. In other words, they have a diagnosis, medical disability, fits the definition of disability, which is usually some medical provider. Usually it's pretty straightforward that you're in 504. However, what does 504 mean? Because remember, it's not funded. And so our 504 coordinator could be the counselor, could be this assistant principal, could be the principal. So they already have two or three other jobs. And so one of the key considerations as we talk about this today is, what is the investment? What is the knowledge? And is that 504 coordinator, usually at each campus, does that 504 coordinator know these things? Do they know how to pull up accommodations? Or is it just a check sheet? And one of the things to be really mindful of as parents or advocates navigate the 504 process, a lot of them are just check sheets, okay? And they don't talk about BIPs. They don't talk about FBAs. They don't talk about that if a student has a behavior and they're assigned to alternative DAP more than 10 days under 504, you also get an MDR. You get a manifestation determination review, just like under IDA. So one of the key things to be really aware of is, what is the knowledge of the 504 coordinator? Because a lot of times they are the ones that are supposed to monitor the plan. And so if a student doesn't pass a semester, the student is falling behind because they are not getting the accommodations, or the accommodations are just prescribed in a very general way. They'll have additional time, they'll have preferred seating, they'll have noise canceling, earmuffs. Really be careful, because as you design accommodations, I found one of the little hacks is to give an example of what that is. Okay, because when you say preferential seating, okay, well, is that closer to the teacher, or it could be closer to the right side, closer to the left side? Because remember, sometimes we hear out of our right ear better than our left ear, or vice versa. So when we talk about preferential seating, or some of these accommodations that are very nebulous, and while it's kind of understood, giving an example within the 504 document helps save a lot of wear and tear. So we really want to encourage that if the accommodation is not clear. Now, it says, hey, we will give a pencil, mechanical pencil, this, and this, it really describes who, what, when, where, great. But a lot of accommodations, they're just very generic, because that's how the system is set up. And so being able to determine what that specific job, what that accommodation is, because accommodations, can be almost anything. Okay. And so I want to give you an example of how you can kind of be proactive. So one of the things that I use is called the Job Accommodation Network. And it's really looking at accommodations for those who are on a job, but it really allows you to explore, what does it look like? In other words, let's just say there's a certain disability or a certain aspect of the disability function. So we kind of go to A to Z as an example, and we can start to define it. Okay. So here, as an example, we can look at, do we want to define it by disability, by limitation, okay, by work-related function, by topic, or by accommodation? So I have found, again, this is one of the little hacks I try to share with all the advocates in our office, is look at the Job Accommodation Networks. If you're not sure, what accommodation is, because remember, the schools are going to use kind of a check sheet. So let's just look at disability. We won't pick on anyone in particular, but let's look at, autism, because that's, you have a new Health and Human Services secretary that talks about it a lot in different ways. So we look under autism. What are the accommodations? Again, it has every, what does it look like? In other words, it does look at it by work related, but it also goes to what's in the classroom. It looks like attentiveness, concentration, executive function. Let's just hit that. Okay. Well, guess what pops up? Oh my goodness. Apps for concentration. That's our executive function. Calendars, apps for memories. Let's just look at that. Sometimes they have this whole set of different things that your typical 504 coordinator will not have. And so there's just so many different things that are out there. Are noise sensitive, because we know that sometimes sensory said, well, what do we have? Okay, hearing protection, noise canceling earbuds, headsets, because earbuds, not every student wants a big old, pair of earmuffs looking thing. So just remember, even though this is really geared for employment, there's just literally thousands and thousands of accommodations that you can begin to design. And I found, sharing this with your 504 coordinator, again, we can start looking at also by limitation. What's the limitation? Sometimes, especially, let's just say, attentiveness and concentration. Well, what's out there? Well, we have alternative. I mean, it's huge. Is it lighting? is it, just, and it has a lot of products to help move you along. I had a student who was in dental school, and he was as ADHD as I've seen anybody. So we got him a smartwatch, where a reminder would go off on his watch every 5 minutes, because he'd feel that vibration. He'd look, oh yeah, what are we going to do? So lots of different possible things that you can look at. I want to make sure you have this resource, because accommodations, and again, oops, sorry. I'm getting lots of alerts. I'm kind of in a flash flood zone. And it also goes to some of the more less, a lot of disabilities that aren't categorical, like lupus, Lyme disease. All these fall under a disability that impairs a major life function. So please keep that in mind, as you are not limited. But I find the Job Accommodation Network a really wonderful thing to share and to explore and open up these conversations about what are the disabilities. Because remember, schools are bureaucracies. We tend to use a lot of the same things over and over and over again. Okay. So also there are protections under 504. They're not as numerous, when we have IDA, it's pretty strong. Okay. However, there's only a few rights that parents have. Because remember, technically, the parent doesn't even have to be part of the 504 committee. Now think about that. Technically, the parent doesn't even have to be there. But now, obviously, most of them do. But technically, a parent doesn't even have to be a measure of that. So just remember is that you have the right to file a complaint either within the campus or OCR, and we'll get to OCR as well. You have the right to get a record of the document. Okay. You have a right to review any records. Okay. You have a right to, I'm going to give you the link here. Just a minute. Yes, lost the, I can give you the TEA 504 protection so you can. Sorry, my computer seems to be glitching. There we go. This is the technical assistance manual on 504 here in Texas. Okay. Has the full guide on 504. And the reason I find if we use the, let's see here, I find if we use the documents that our own agency puts out, I find if we use the documents that schools put out using, not something, COPA puts out stuff, TOPAA puts out stuff, there's Rights Law puts out stuff. It's really, really important. Okay. But I find if we use the documents that they use, or we find if we use their guides, it has almost immediate credibility. So we're not coming in, I love Rights Law. I love all the COPA books. They tell us a lot of wonderful things. It's absolutely amazing what we're getting taught, but sometimes our friends in our different campuses, that really, it doesn't really help. So this is the main manual I want to make sure we share, and we'll go through some of it as well. But I want to make sure you're familiar with the basics in terms of what you can do. And 38 has the procedural safeguards, because the meetings are pretty straightforward. But the procedural safeguards, what do you do when things go wrong? Because that's kind of the conversation we have today. So the procedural safeguards, again, a little different than IDA, but the procedural safeguards are, kind of pretty straightforward. Okay, you get notice. You have an opportunity for parents to examine regular records. there's a record for review procedure following the hearing, as well as you get an impartial hearing. Now, here's where now some states, like in New Jersey and Virginia, a hearing officer can hear both IDA and 504 claims. Well, in Texas, we only have a rare 504 meeting. Why? Is that the impartial hearing officer is appointed by the school. Okay, let me repeat that. Is you can request a 504 hearing. Okay, remember, and we also have local grievance procedures as well. That's your level 1, 2, 3 complaint we've talked about. But unfortunately, the hearing officers in Texas for 504 are contracted by the school. And so usually those hearing officers that rule against the school, they're no longer the 504 hearing officers. And the last, I guess, I'm doing less and less of them. Usually I just do it because it puts pressure on the school. But they're attorneys who work for the schools as the 504 hearing officer. So we tend to not use that very often. Okay. Questions? Any questions? I have found that OCR has been our go-to, and OCR still exists. Our OCR office, since our Dallas OCR was vaporized, is in Kansas City. Now, we are getting correspondence from our Kansas City office, but we've not seen any action. They've done some intakes. They've done some acknowledged that we've sent complaints in. Okay, that's fine. But we've not seen any decisions from Kansas City since early on. 9 of the 9 OCR offices were vaporized, and there's 5 left. And I think they went into there's 6,000 complaints they had. So that's really, really harder to do. So a lot of things we're reverting to our level 1, 2, 3, and we'll go in our second hour. We'll go into that, how to look at that. Again, retaliation. All these are things are prohibited, and there are some technical resources as well. All right, coming up to the top of the hour, and I'm going to take a little break to see if there's any questions so far. I'm going to take a break so we can start at 9 and just rip through a lot of times. What do we do when things go wrong? And I'll kind of give you the 4 things we do here in Texas, and this is Texas specific because other states don't have that level 1, 2, 3 internal grievance process of which we can use a 504 level 1, 2, 3 for 504 based on discrimination, retaliation, disparate treatment, or harassment as well, which are protected by 504. Actually, it's almost like an internal OCR complaint. All right, any questions? We'll take a 4 or 5 minute break and then we'll come back. Any questions? And also welcome everybody who's joined us. Really appreciate you being here after a very difficult 4th of July here in Texas. Many floods down around the Kerrville area. Guadalupe River just went high over its bank, caused a lot of death and destruction. So if you're in Texas, please be careful where you are. Any questions from anyone so far? All right. It's 8:57. Let's come back in 5 minutes and we'll crank it up and talk about how do we address things in 2025? A lot more challenging than previous years. All right. Just put your question in the chat. I'm going to put my email as well. I've had a couple of folks email me because they get a question after we've had our presentation. All right, there's my email, Special Ed Marine. Let's come back in 5 minutes. Thank y'all. So a couple things. Again, I want to make sure you have all the different pieces as resource, because that's really one of the things that are so important, is that you have the resources, because this is just the I call basic entry level, so you have the idea. So one of the things, of course, we see over and over, one of our trusty fallbacks is 504, and always on rights law. They've been part of our lives as an advocate and parent for a very long time. So they always have a resource. And again, they have lots of different information that you can use in terms of, depending on how deep you want to move into this. Okay. So rights law is just always just an incredible resource for those things that you have. Okay. And there's all sorts of guides, there's OSEP letters, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's some new regulations that talk about 504 and disabilities. I'll let you kind of look at that as well. All right. Very good. All right, so in Texas, how do we, 504 plan, very simple document. Usually 504 lists accommodations, disabilities, and anything that you'd like to have in there. But one of the things that's really, really important is what do we do when something goes wrong? What do we do when they're not following a 504 plan, or we have an argument over the 504 plan, or what do we do? Because you can disagree and we don't have the same rights of coming back over and over. So basically what we have, and there's kind of four things that you really look at in terms of what can we do. So one, it's less helpful than the past. We have an OCR discrimination complaint, because if you're not, and remember, you can file an OCR complaint under ID as well, because if you don't have an accommodation, it's not enforced. That's discrimination. If you're not following, the teachers are not following it, again, 504 has the authority. What do they can investigate: race, color, national origin, ethnicity, persons, all these different things, as disability, as well as retaliation. Yeah, retaliation. Or if you've made a complaint. So and it covers all the schools. The problem we're having in 2025 is OCR. That we used to have for 35 plus years, we had an OCR office in Dallas, where they've been eliminated. So there's only 5 OCR offices left. We see TOPAA and other entities have sued the federal government to keep their that function alive, and so far I think they've won. Unfortunately, because of the change of administration, investigation by the Office of Civil Rights at the Department of Education has not worked very well. Okay, again, this used to be one of our primary go-to pieces, still is. Okay, we still have a complaint form that we can follow. And again, what's a complaint form? It's name and address. What went wrong? What do you want? It's online. You can submit that. So the problem, though, the challenge we have in 2025 is, yes, we can still file OCR complaints, but do they have an impact? And so we're still trying to figure that out, because those that I have filed in January, they say, yeah, we got them, but there's no movement. And I suspect that's because of the nine offices that closed, those 6,000 other complaints had to go somewhere. And it just seems like our Kansas City office is overlooked, and Kansas City is now covering us. So what do you do? So usually let's start on ground zero. Let's go to the campus. And so your 504 meeting is the most important place to get something done, but let's just say it doesn't work out. So the next step is, let's talk about who is the 504 coordinator and what do they know. So is the impediment at the 504 meeting at the campus level, is it because the accommodation, they don't understand it? Is the accommodation because they're not trained? Is the accommodation or the 504 service, whatever it may be, why is it not getting off the paper and implemented? So this goes back to the administrative chain of command. Think of it like the military. The lieutenant's in charge of the platoon, the captain's in charge of the company, the major's in charge of the battalion. It does have a chain of command. So the principal has the authority and budget to hire and fire everyone on campus. So a lot of times, if it's a campus issue, certainly you have a conversation. And again, depending on who your 504 coordinator is, because your 504 coordinator in the campus can be a whole range of them. It could be a teacher, could be the counselor, could be the assistant principal. Typically, we see the assistant principal or counselor being the 504 coordinators. But do they know what that is? Do they know what that is? And if they don't, sometimes you're going to use that chain of command going to the principal. First as a conversation, or you go to your level 1, 2, 3. Every one of your 504 procedural safeguards is you have to have an internal grievance policy. Internal grievance policy to file a 504 complaint. Okay. And remember, level 1, 2, 3, which we have in Texas, is what follows that. Your level 1 is principal or designee. Or level 2 is superintendent or designee. Level 3 is the board. And what I like about the board is they have to take a vote. Okay, so any of those same complaints that you saw in the OCR complaint, you can also you can also put it in as well. Now, a lot of times, and I'm going to use Round Rock as an example. And again, even the smaller districts, you have to have a designated 504 coordinator, an ADA coordinator. Okay, somebody is in charge. So in your chain of command is that, as an example, we have, they have to designate who's your Title IX coordinator for those issues, who's your ADA coordinator. Well, so here in Round Rock, it's not unusual for the 504 coordinator over the entire school. We see this in Austin, Round Rock, Dallas, Houston. There's a 504 coordinator for the entire district. Okay. There's a 504 coordinator for the entire district, and you can file a specific internal complaint, okay, within that chain of command. Okay. You have that because that's part of, again, it says you have policies somewhere in the board, in the policies and procedures of every district. Now, whether they have them posted or not, that's always going to be that. So let's just go here, student welfare. And somewhere in their board book, it talks about these different, does somebody can report internally, and these generic policies are available under all school districts. Okay. And again, it could be sexual harassment, it could be deliberate indifference, it could be, see, there's a whole process that goes through, because in this is you cannot, again, they may have a 504 page. There'll be somewhere in your manual, they'll have policies for filing a complaint for freedom for discrimination, harassment, or retaliation, which are all protected under 504. So as you go through the chain of command, and we're looking at policy and procedure, also look at what is the training for your 504 coordinator. Are they training? Because a lot of times it's just a matter of training. Because a lot of times they're not, a 504 coordinator doesn't always know what all accommodations are. 504 coordinator doesn't always know that a student can have related services, or at least a consult with related services. 504 coordinator doesn't always not know what to do with an MDR. How often is there an MDR under 5? How often is there a manifestation determination review under 504? 504 coordinator may or may not know that they can include an FBA and a BIP in a 504 plan. So we have the internal complaint, which is your level 1, 2, 3. We have and again, you can look at your level 1, 2, 3 covers almost anything. It could be the training, it could be the implementation, because sometimes your 504 coordinator is fine, but it's the teacher that's not providing the accommodation, or it's the teacher. Could be we run into this, football coaches, band teachers, extracurriculars. Those 504 accommodations can extend to those pieces. Band directors. Oh my goodness, that seems to be my that seems to be a thing this semester. Band directors are not giving the extra time. Band teachers, what is what does this preferential seating look like in band or marching band? So these are things you have to kind of work through. And sometimes the 504 coordinator does not have the authority. Okay, think about this. They don't have the authority. It's the principal that has the authority, or you have to use your chain of command. And that's where your 504 coordinator or superintendent come in. And that's why in Texas, the level 1, 2, 3 process seems to be our main intervention and technique that we use to get their attention. Again, always have the conversation and sometimes bring more and more information, just as we put the 504 TEA guide there, using as much information as you can within the school. Or do they even have procedures written out? Because sometimes, because of the turnover, because of the pandemic, budget, etc., a 504 coordinator just, you're the 504 coordinator. This is what you do. Here's the here's a one sheet training manual. So remember, in dealing with our 504 issues in Texas, it's real important to look at who is your 504 coordinator. Does the principal know what that is? Using your chain of command. Again, it could be an email, it could be a conversation, if you can. But the level 1, 2, 3 process has been our main intervention over the last year and seems to be heading that way more and more since OCR is they exist, but they're not investigating complaints as they more robustly did pre-pandemic and now with the change of administration. We also have a 504 hearing, but one of the issues, and again, you can, sometimes it's okay if it's something minimal, but unfortunately, the school, the district you're in, gets to select the 504 hearing officer. That's tough. That's tough. So just keep that in mind on those interventions. Also, one of the other things that sometimes comes up is we have a lot of subs. We have a lot of, I've given out some of the statistics that we have, 40% uncertified teachers in general, and special ed, I think 60% uncertified who are coming in to the program. And so training, supervision, and monitoring of all these individuals who may be teaching that student that you're either a parent for or an advocate for, that comes back. That is almost the number one thing that we talk about, because do they even know what 504 is supposed to do? Do they even know how to craft that reasonable accommodation? That's why you have the Job Accommodation Network, as to list these particular accommodations for the student, because we have our charts, we have our software, we have our forms, but they are very cookie cutter. And even if it's an experienced 504 coordinator, not seeing too many of those, but even if it's a 504 experienced coordinator, where do we have that ability to make sure that they're trained? And remember, you can ask under record, and this is kind of the last thing I want to really talk about. You can ask what the certification, what the degree, what the in-service training is for any educator through open record request. In other words, if we're not sure, or it seems like they're not, and it's okay. I mean, you do this for the dentist, you do this for, you do a Yelp search for your favorite restaurant. And when we're talking about the children we serve as advocates or as parents, why don't we know what is their background? Have they been there 10 years? Have they been there 15 years? Or are they just, recent graduate from college? And so knowing the environment you're in, I mean, really embracing the environment you're in is really, really important, because a lot of times we assume that the schools know what they're doing. Sometimes they do, but you cannot assume that anymore. And that's why the parent and the advocate, we're the quality assurance, because the feds don't do it, the state doesn't do it, schools don't have the internal reviews they once had. So the quality assurance for everything in this process, not just IDA, but 504 as well, is the quality assurance belongs to the parent or their advocate to make sure things are being done correctly. So, and parents ask me, David, you're not expecting me to do an open record request every 3 weeks? No, but usually having a 5 as an example, one of the things, if there's questionable implementation of a 504 plan, have a 504 meeting at the end of each semester. Why? Just like the bean counters at Walmart. If you come back once a semester and review the accommodations, are they being implemented? Are they being effective? Do the substitute teachers have how to implement an accommodation or BIP or other support that 504 has? Do they know this? Again, 504 is relatively simple compared to IDA, but the quality assurance belongs nowadays, effective quality assurance belongs to the parent and or their advocate. So this is why I really want to emphasize that asking questions, doing open record requests, and again, not to and sometimes when we ask questions, you know, what's your certifications, what's your training, individuals at the campus level can become very defensive because they're not used to being asked questions by the advocate or the parent. They're not used to being challenged. They're not used to say, hey, send me your last in-service on how to implement an accommodation for ADHD. What does that mean? Well, that's because everything is cookie cutter. We've been relying on these procedures. And if you're not an experienced 504 coordinator at the campus level, usually sometimes the parent knows more than the 504 coordinator or the teachers. Because when we bring evaluations in, whether it's just a, hey, the kid has, it could be a simple letter, it could be even a prescription. Hey, kid has Tourette's, and that kicks off the process that they have the same affirmative duty under 504 as they do under IDA, is to assess. And there's no cost to do that, because sometimes we see with ADHD as a 504 eligibility, they said we need a doctor's note. No, you don't need a doctor's note, or or the expense goes to them. Again, schools don't always do that. This is why we have this discussion here, is that there should not be any expense upon a parent or family in any of the IDA or 504 processes. Okay. All right. Last piece, and then we'll get into question, answer, anything that you want to explore. Last piece is usually use the expertise within the school if you can. And so while campus 504 coordinators are, you know, hit or miss, maybe you get a good one, maybe you don't. Usually you'll find that the special ed director or if they have a separate 504 coordinator, because the big districts like Dallas and Houston, they have their own separate 504 coordinator. They're the ones that should be knowledgeable. I think I used the Round Rock as an example. Well, the special ed coordinator and 504 coordinator for the district, samey, because there is that kind of overlap, because sometimes 504 does lead into special ed, or sometimes if they're being considered for special ed, maybe they go into 504. So we see there is an overlap within the special ed and 504 disciplines in the chain of command at the top of the food chain. Okay, but use the expertise within the school if you can. It's just a lot shorter because those other options outside of the 504 process at the campus or within the district level, such as the OCR complaint, the due process hearing that you're allowed under 504, those are just not as effective as we would like. So anytime you can really, and again, sometimes you can hit, you know, just a teacher that won't do it. We see this in the G gifted or AP classes. They think that accommodation is giving the student with a disability an unfair advantage. Well, no, it's just yeah. So they may have 100 zillion IQ. Well, they just need that accommodation because they have ADHD, or they need that accommodation because they have cerebral palsy, or they have that accommodation because it's just equal access and equal opportunity. And that's how we try to explain it. We're not trying to get over. We're not trying to get unfair advantage. It's an equal access and equal opportunity for that student to participate like their non-disabled peers. Okay. All right. Well, that wraps up kind of the formal side of this. It's pretty straightforward. Remember, any federal, if they get federal money, 504 applies. And you have a range of options, both at the local level as well as the federal level. TA does not look at 504 complaints. And that's why our level 1, 2, 3 internal complaint system for 504 tends to be one of our main approaches these days, 2025. All right, questions, thoughts, comments? Y'all have been pretty quiet so far this morning. Hope you've had your coffee by the second hour. Let's, who would like to jump in with questions? Or if I need to go back and look at any of the other information, we can do that as well.
Could you maybe talk about one of your latest 504 hearings that you've done?
Sure. This was out in, I think it was at Belton. I think it was Belton. Okay, so real simple. It's just they'll sometimes have a form And I'll use, let's see if I pull it up for Round Rock here. Sometimes they have a form. It says request for 504 hearing, or sometimes they don't, or sometimes it's just an email. Request for 504, and usually they have about 30 days or so to have it. And it's not a hearing in the sense that your cross-examination, it's a presentation of information. It's a presentation of information. And the part of the issues they have is, that again, it's real simple. And part of the presentation of information, it's just presenting information. You can't, you can present witnesses, but you don't cross-examine. I think they had Bill Beekler and Cindy Beekler. They're two attorneys in Austin. And I've seen Bill Beekler probably do the majority of 504 hearings over the last 5 years. Again, and it's just a presentation of information. And then the hearing officer comes back and makes a ruling. It's a very simple process. Almost anyone can do it. Unfortunately, the 504 hearing, because they appoint the hearing officer, really is biased unless you have kind of a smoking gun, or you have somebody from the school that's going to help. You have a document that says, hey, I'm sorry, I didn't implement the 504 accommodation. So that's really, 504 hearings are just not something I've found very helpful. Now, sometimes I have found, though, it is a nuisance in terms of, they have to go through these particular pieces. And again, it's a logistically, logistical effort on part of the school. And also, sometimes they're an expense, because usually I'm going to charge somebody to go to a 504 hearing, but the outcome is so school oriented because they get to pick the hearing officer. That's the problem. That's why sometimes we'll use it as an attempt to get their attention. But just like in special ed, a lot of times, only 90%, only 10% of all special ed hearings go to hearing. Same way with 504. Usually, if you're within the area code of reason and they see exposure, usually it's going to get worked out. Okay. But 504 hearings, again, it's a right, but they don't have the same accoutrements, protocol, processes they do under IDA. So it's not something I encourage, because the hearing officers are appointed by the school district, and it's just a presentation of information. It's not crossing. You don't get to examine the witnesses. You can present witnesses, present information. Unfortunately, we don't have that a true due process right as you see in other states. In Virginia and New Jersey, as example, that you're in front of a non-school based hearing officer, or at least a hearing officer not selected by the school. Robin, does that answer your question?
Yeah, I just was interested. Do the districts that you've done 504 hearings in, are they like radically different from district to district?
No, generally not.
Okay.
Generally not. As again, the hearing officer, controls the hearing, and usually they'll have just a little sheet of how to present witnesses each side. And then also it's not very long. Sometimes you get 2 hours, sometimes you get an hour. It's a very minimal type of process. Almost anyone can do it. Sometimes I ask parents, have you watched Judge Judy? And parents say, yeah, can you do Judge Judy? Yeah. So it's kind of like 504 Judge Judy, just like special ed. That's special ed Judge Judy. But it's a little more complicated these days because of all the accoutrements that you have to file. But generally, remember, all these procedural safeguards, whether 504 IDA, they were designed for parents to do. Okay, think about this. All the procedural safeguards in 504 and IDA were designed for parents to do it now. Okay. So I believe that parents can do 90% of what an advocate does, because there are no secrets that advocates have. Everything we do or know is actually based for parents to know. Okay. All right, other questions? Other questions? May wrap up a little early today. But this is, so I think the most important question we have in 504, do we have the appropriate accommodations for the student? And are those accommodations effective? So sometimes in the 504 meeting, two questions to really make sure is how will the teachers know, including substitutes, how will they know how to implement the accommodations? Okay. And if you can get it written in there, fine. Sometimes they have a protocol. In other words, they share the plan. Well, depending on the teacher, depending on the subject matter, depending on, are they a long-term substitute or is it a substitute teacher? So one of the key pieces I find, and it doesn't take very long, is to make sure somewhere in the document, just by asking the questions, how the teachers be informed of how the accommodation will be implemented. Are they just given the page from the paper? Is it in the substitute folder? Because remember, with all the substitutes, both short-term, long-term, how do the substitutes know how to implement the plan? Well, most schools have what's called the substitute folder. And if they go into a classroom, those students on IEPs, those students on 504 plans, they have a folder for that substitute teacher to look at. So just by asking those questions and making sure it's embedded into the 504 plan. Otherwise, it's just, I mean, sometimes 504 plans are very minimal. There's just a couple accommodations. And there's no what I call specialized instructions. And that's why it's really important to have that wide-ranging conversation for what does that student need to have equal access and equal opportunity throughout the day based on the accommodations, the behavior plan, other supports. Again, we've even had, you can even have a one-on-one under 504. Now, schools wince at that because remember, 504 doesn't get paid. So a lot of times you may see a switch from 504 to special ed, because special ed, there's money. 504, there is no money. And the 504 coordinator usually is, it's an added on title, and they're doing 2 or 3 other jobs as well. So that's just the reality of 504 in Texas. Is that it?
Could you just speak briefly on 504 MDR hearings and maybe how they're run?
Sure. Well, 504, those not familiar with an MDR, if a student is out of placement 10 or more days, either consecutively or cumulatively, again, it could be 10 days in a row, or it could be 10 days over a semester or a year. And that could be your ISS, that could be your in-school suspension, out-of-school suspension. So if a student has been suspended 10 days or more, they're entitled to an MDR. It's a manifestation determination review, which is a meeting of the committee, in this case, the 504 committee, to determine whether the disability and the behavior were related. In other words, if they have a disciplinary incident, they've just been assigned to DAP for a student code of conduct violation for 11 days. Well, before day 10, they're going to have a meeting to determine whether or not the behavior was a direct and substantial link to the disability, and because remember, there's 2 questions in any kind of MDR meeting. It's the same as a IDA or ARD MDR. And so there's 2 questions. Is the disability have a direct and substantial link to the behavior? And was the school implementing the plan at the time? Okay, was the school implementing the plan at the time? And this is why if it's a 504 student that's having lots of behaviors and there's ISS or they've been sent to DAP for a week, this is where you can bring up a BIP as well as an FBA under 504. Now, sometimes the committee knows that, sometimes they don't. It's not common as it might be under the IDA process, but you can request a behavioral accommodation. You can request a behavioral intervention plan. You can request an FBA to get the behavioral intervention plan. All those are possible. And as you do the MDR, again, if a student has been, if 10 days or more, has been out of placement, okay, we're sending them home early, ISS, OSS, out of school suspension, DAP placement, or if they're just sitting in the office, because sometimes we see these patterns where we send the kid home early, okay, that's out of placement, okay, 10 or more consecutively or cumulatively, they're entitled to an MDR. In fact, sometimes you can even request an MDR ahead of that to see if it is related to disability. Schools usually don't like that, but the idea is if, because we see this a lot in kids with ADHD, they're off task. They don't sit still. They're moving around the classroom. They're impulsive, and sometimes we just have in middle school, or sometimes some hard taskers in elementary school, they want these kids to sit still. They don't want them roaming around. They don't want them kneeling in their seat. And so they assign, ISS, or they assign lunch detention. Well, lunch detention is moves them out of the placement. They're no longer in lunch. They're cleaning the table, or whatever lunch detention is, or it's after school detention. Any of those things that move the student out of placement, those 10 days, placement's placement, okay? Even if it's an hour, they're out of placement. And an MDR is a good way to determine if indeed that behavior is related to disability. Again, it has to be, again, there's this scale of like 0 to 10. So yes, it could be related, but is there a direct and substantial link? Was that behavior caused by the disability? And part 2 of an MDR question was the plan, as defined by the 504 plan the student's eligible covered under, is it being implemented? Because sometimes you may not get to prong 1. It may not be a direct and substantial link. It also may be because they didn't implement the accommodation. That's not uncommon, because sometimes it's understanding the topic, or sometimes you got to wait. Like I said, one of the behavioral accommodations is give the student 15 seconds before responding, because sometimes you ask a student who may or may not be paying full attention, or has a disability that processing is an issue. Sometimes you give them time to respond. Okay. So there is a wide range of eligibilities, but the fact that we have the ability to have an MDR is really significant under 504. Again, there's 504 in itself is, again, really straightforward compared to IDA.
How often do you see the school moving ahead with like an MDR under 504 without the parent?
Well, notification of the parent has to occur, but sometimes they don't. Sometimes they don't remember to do it. I find students under 504 sometimes they forget to do it, because it's just not an automatic requirement as it is, or they don't think it's an automatic requirement. So that's where I think sometimes I've seen a lot of the issues is they forget. Now they've had 3 days ISS in the fall, 3 days ISS right before spring break, 4 days of ISS after spring break, and they've hit that 10-day mark. They just don't do it. They don't look at it as through the same lens as IDA, because remember that 504 coordinator already has 2 other job titles: counselor, assistant principal. We've seen a coach be a 504. It's just kind of potluck on how they select their 504 coordinators, and sometimes schools don't always have a kind of a standard criteria on how that occurs. And that's why the parent or advocate being well versed and knowledgeable about 504 is really kind of a key. Other questions and thoughts? Yes.
So I'm finding it interesting that the MDR is part of the 504, because in what stuff I've gone through, it's never really been mentioned. But one of the things that I've run into is school districts calling parents because their child is having behaviors, and having them pick them up, and then the parent not realizing that that's considered a change in placement, a removal, and they're not, the school won't mark it down as an absent because the parent comes pick them up, but the parent's not realizing that that's an out of placement, because they're being called in to take the child. So there's a lot of times ends up being confusion, at least on the IEP side. But now the 504 has got me going, oh my gosh. That it's important for the parents to be tracking those, because I don't think the school districts necessarily are. I think they're putting that onto the parents, saying, well, we're having challenges, and then the parent comes and picks them up, and then they're technically out of placement for these number of days, but the school's not counting them necessarily as absences or change of placements.
Yeah, placement is where that student is during the day, similar to his non-disabled peers, which is a full school day. And so if anything, and as you just said, we tend to see that because sometimes schools get away with saying, hey, come pick up your kid. Or, hey, we'd rather not, have to file a formal student code of conduct violation. Come get your kid. But yeah, that is a change of placement because the school, not the parent, has taken that child out of the regular placement. And yeah, I mean, we've even argued lunch detention, right? Because lunch detention is an exclusionary placement. Okay, anything that's because remember, what is the purpose of 504? Is equal access and equal opportunity, just like the non-disabled peers. And so, if indeed, because even if you're not 504 or special ed, in 10 days you still get a regular due process hearing. In other words, even if you weren't under 504 or under IDA, you do get substantial rights. There was I think it was Lopez versus Goss in 1972, because prior to this is that students could be suspended, expelled forever. There was not a timeline. But in this I think it was 72, Lopez versus Goss, they said, no, there's a substantial due process right that you have a kind of a hearing. Again, it's the school's personnel, so it's not like, hearing with the guy in the black robes, but it is a hearing where you get to present evidence, cross-examine, etc. Same is true, because remember, there's two things that all students have. So just say vaping, right? Here's a great example. Is vaping is, they've changed the law this semester, but the prior semester said, okay, any kid who gets caught vaping goes to DAP, right? And so immediately, some places were 2 weeks. Well, that immediately triggered an MDR. So was vaping a related to disability? Again, technically, probably not, because a vape is a vape, but they still have to have an MDR both under IDA and 504, but they also have a student code of conduct hearing. So you have two bites at the apple whenever there's a DAP issue involved, more than 10 days. You have the regular student code of conduct hearing, which is a chain of command. Again, usually the principal or assistant principal will make the recommendation. Remember, conference, hearing, meeting can all be interchangeable, because when you say a 504, if you say, hey, we had a principal conference, a principal hearing, is that you had, that was a hearing, even though it might have been a phone call, because the initiation of a disciplinary placement usually starts with the principal or assistant principal. Then after that, the different rights to apply, because if it's 10 days or less, there's not a whole lot you have. You can file a complaint, of course, but a 3-day suspension, 5-day suspension, because you think about it, most out of school suspensions are 3 days. Well, 3 days in the middle of a week or a holiday, that could be really mess up a student's flow. So you can still file complaints, because if you go back, because I've tried to argue that, hey, 3 days out of school suspension, why 3 days? Why do we have the standard cookie cutter of out of school suspension for 3 days? Makes no sense. Makes no sense at all. So there's a lot of different things, because at least if they're in school, if they're in school suspension, they're still getting their academics. And then because sometimes students, let's just say it's a 4-day holiday, I mean a 3-day weekend, and you've suspended the kid for 3 days and he's only in school 1 day, what does that do to that flow and that connection for the academics as well as non-academics? Because sometimes our students who are in 504, that's their rhythm of catching the school bus, their rhythm with that classroom is completely thrown off when they're gone for 3 days. And or if they're going to be out of placement in 10 days. Now, the other piece I want to mention is that 504 plan follows that student into DAP. Now, DAP sometimes has their own rules, their own regulations. You sit here, it's very structured, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But the 504 plan, whatever it is, still follows that student into DAP. Okay. Did I answer your question? Because the idea of an MDR is not to have exclusionary placements. But 10-day is a magic mark both for a student code of conduct hearing as well as 504. Now, our one other thing we'll talk about are that the in a student code of conduct, and this is separate from the 504 we're doing, but in one of the 4 considerations in a student code of conduct hearing is, does the child have a disability? Separate and distinct from the MDR process, there's 4 factors that have to be included in a DAP hearing. One of them, does the student have a disability? Okay, because remember, does the student have a disability? Really kind of a key question. Okay. And the 4 factors, I'll put them on the screen. There's 4 factors determining disciplinary actions. Okay. And while it's not as specific as an MDR, it is included in disability. I'll put it on the screen. So when there's any kind of disciplinary action to a DAP, there's 4 factors, and this is, and the reason I mention this, one of them include, was there a disability? Okay. And the other one's intent. You know, that was the student, was there an intentionality in that behavioral incident? Then also, again, this is not part of the MDR. It says, does the disability substantially impair their capacity to understand the wrongfulness of their conduct? So remember that not only do we have the MDR, where they determine was there a direct and substantial link to the disability, and were they following the plan? That's under 504. And there's also this other consideration in Texas under disabilities, under any place, because sometimes that eligibility, you know, just like under IDA or 504, they may have a medical eligibility that's not under 504. Maybe their 504 eligibility is ADHD. However, under a medical diagnosis that hasn't been considered yet, they may have autism, or they may have some other, they may have depression, they may have a mental health diagnosis. So that's why I wanted to mention that there's these other 4 factors that have to be included as part of the DAP, as part of the consideration of the principal. This is under the non-IDA or non-504 folks. Okay. Hope that makes sense. All right. Anything else? We may wrap up a little early. This session under 504, and we'll do ADA next week as well. They kind of go together. Also, let me throw one under thing. How many folks have heard of 508? Okay, 508. It's not 504 plus 4. It's 508. And the reason I mentioned 508, it's really a compliance. It was the first federal law that came out of the Rehabilitation Act, just like 504 came out of that section, is 508. 508 is it's the requirements to ensure that electronic information, the web, is accessible. Okay. Not everybody uses a mouse. There's Braille, there's screen readers, there's JAWS, there's Kurzweil. These are screen readers. there are voice to text, text to voice. And so 504, this is 1999. Remember, the internet was not as well established, but under 508 mandates that federal agencies have to ensure that their websites are accessible visually. Just like here, not just like, if you needed translation or if you needed something to make sure I was understood, as I think some may have the captions on, and it's now just doesn't apply. And again, this was the federal requirement, but now we have state requirements that all websites or things in digital formats are accessible. Okay, 508. Just wanted to make sure it's not just, because remember, it's equal access and equal access and equal opportunity, and whatever that is, including the school's website. All right. Any last questions for 504 today? Again, real basic. And look at the information I've had. Got the dyslexia manual, got the 504 manual. If you want to take a deep dive, again, this is just what I call the basics. Make sure you have at least a working knowledge of what these things are. And that's our purpose of this 10-week course, not to make you experts, but make sure you have just basic knowledge and material that you can dive off into. Again, I use Wright's Law as kind of one of my faves. It's been around for a long, long time. And 504, and there's all sorts of variations of 504. So your Wright's Law website. And again, there's just so many different ways to look at it. There's other websites that have 504 as well, but it's really, really, and I'll put one more. They have different variations on the Wright's Law website. As example, one of my faves here is that my 504 plan is not working. What do? School won't help. And they come up with a game plan. They come up with a game plan. What do you do? All right. And a lot of this you can Google as well. I mean, again, there's a zillion websites that talk about 504, but I wanted to use what TEA puts out. Because remember, I have found, again, that if we're using the Texas Educational Agency generator or the Regional Service Center information being generated, it's an easier conversation. I mean, what COPA has, wonderful. What TOPAA has, wonderful. Whatever Wright's Law has, wonderful. But sometimes that may or may not have traction with the school. But if it's coming from TEA, and you're using that as a basis for complaint, they're not following TEA guidelines. And it just, from my point of view, using their information, using the school's policy procedures, using the state policy procedures, using anything that's generated for the school as part of our complaint or part of the conversation, I find it has a lot more traction than if we're bringing it in. Oh yes, I was in a California conference and this is what I learned. And if they're open to it, great. But following the policies and procedures. So they used to have a 504 compliance manual in many of the districts. I've not seen that very often. All right, we're at that time to wind down. Thank you all very much. We'll be jumping into ADA and Olmsted and integrated community settings next week under ADA. Thank you all very much for being here. Very much appreciate it. We'll hit the halfway mark next week. This is session number 4. We'll be at number 5 next week. Feel free to send me emails if you have any information.